Good afternoon, everyone. It's 2 o'clock, so we must reconvene. Thank you very much for coming back from lunch so promptly. My name is Nigel Llewellyn, Head of Research at Tate. Not Tate Britain or Tate Modern, but Tate, right in the middle of this federal organisation that we run. We've got a very exciting afternoon of presentations and questions. Please don't forget that there are many opportunities to lodge questions to take part in the debate, even if you're not going to be standing at this rostrum. First of all, there's the famous box, the Myron cardboard box, which is down here in front of me. And also, there are possibilities of communicating electronically in ways that some of us of a certain age find a bit of a challenge. I'm just going to point out Patrick. Here he is down at front. Patrick, why don't you wave your hand here? Patrick's going to be chairing the final section of the day, which is the question and answer section at the end. If at the end of this section or the end of the afternoon you've got questions or lines of questioning which you think would be particularly useful to engage with, then why don't you have a word with Patrick, perhaps over tea, and he can just log you, and maybe bring you into the discussion, which is going to close the afternoon. Now, the topic for this afternoon is where is British art? We know that some British art is at Tate Britain, but we vowed that we're going to try to broaden the conversation this afternoon, just to get away from this particular institution. The Great British Art Debate has been undertaken on the basis of a collective endeavour. There are 4 partners, and whatever the political balance is between them, we all feel that we are equal partners in that. So the question is, where is British art? And the first of our 3 speakers, each of whom are going to be sticking to that 20-minute slot, is Peter Lord. I got to know Peter a year or so ago when he took a very active part in a research network we ran on folk art, and played a very valuable role in the discussions there, and I'm looking forward to hearing him this afternoon. His biography is in the pack, and his topic is where is British art? Peter Lord, thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Pnawn da chi gyd, mae'n braf iawn cael bod yma eich blych chi yn Llundain heddi. I've been writing for many years about a phenomenon that I first perceived in Wales in the 1970s. The phenomenon is best described as, I think, as a disjunct experienced in Wales between visual culture as expressed in the dominant redaction of tradition, presented in museums and texts, and ways of feeling identity in that place, ways of feeling Welsh, ways, plural, of feeling Welsh. Put in simple language, that means, for instance, that 25 years ago or so, after a walk around the art galleries of the National Museum of Wales, one tended to emerge thinking, if I can get this to work, there we are, one tended to emerge thinking, well, that was very nice, yes, lovely, but it's got nothing much to do with me. And the early texts that I wrote, notably Cultural Policy, which was about the support of new artistic practice, and in particular the Aesthetics of Relevance, which was about art history, caused a great fuss, hence the hanging down there, because it ventured to suggest that for a Welsh person to emerge from the national collection of art feeling that it was irrelevant was not an acceptable, what we should now call, visitor experience. In my analysis of the causes of that experience, I questioned in particular the way the art establishment understood the nature of tradition through the dominant self-referential mainstream. Now, to the art establishment of the period, even the notion that tradition might be a construct that expressed not a fact or a truth, but a culture-specific perception proved quite shocking. In fact, I was very shocked by how shocked they were. What was absolutely unconscionable was to go beyond the theoretical position and to suggest that in the particular case of Wales, the problematic culture-specific perception was the construct of English hegemony wrapped up in the guise of Britishness. This was perceived in Wales as deeply threatening, not only because it associated art with politics as a matter of principle, but it associated it with a particular politics, nationalist politics, with which I was engaged, and that was anathema to them. I was informed by the chair of an Arts Council meeting in Wales, for instance, that was called to consider my cultural policy document, that, I quote, "we fought wars to stop this sort of thing." Well, it happened. The dominant narrative of tradition to which they were wedded was that of what we can call Welsh contributionism, a concept that had been consistently applied by the Welsh political and intellectual establishment in every sphere, political, economic, artistic, for several hundred years. In the field with which we're concerned today, Welsh visual culture was only considered valid insofar as its products could be flowed seamlessly into the English redaction of mainstream European high art history. The value of Welsh products was judged on the basis of the mainstream's concept of artistic excellence. Kerry Richards is perhaps the classic example. Deviant forms, however culturally significant in a Welsh context, were not recognised, and deviant contemporary practitioners were simply not acknowledged. Now, we needn't go further into that today because I want to identify two things that have happened in the intervening 25 years which have affected the nature of the arguments in Wales. The first change is a change in the national political context. The establishing of a National Assembly for Wales might not constitute a full-blown political post-colonialism, but it has created a climate in which establishment rhetoric has been adjusted to acknowledge the legitimacy of Welsh claims to particularity. Nevertheless, we should be mindful of the famous dictum that things have to change in order to remain the same. And there is much evidence to suggest that many people remain committed to self-referential art forms, both in contemporary practice and in their understandings of art history. And I want to give you a small practical example. I'm very concerned to be practical about this today so that you know how these things work and what the implications are. As late as 1986, the mainstream narrative of Welsh art history excluded the work of the painter Evan Walters. The Welsh Arts Council's supposedly authoritative publication, Art in Wales, dismissed him in 2 sentences, and he was not illustrated at all. Kerry Richards, for instance, in that same publication, received 6 pages of text and 15 reproductions. Now, in contrast to that, my own 1998 publication, The Visual Culture of Wales, following a methodology that validated pictures in terms of their relevance to the evolution of Welsh society rather than to the mainstream art tradition, sought to reveal him as a major painter. His pictures, as a result, became visible, and in 2006 there was an exhibition of his work for the first time since his death over 50 years earlier. But it wasn't curated by me. Now, the chance to see the works in this exhibition was very welcome, but the interpretation was not, since it was entirely concerned to locate the painter in the hierarchy of the mainstream tradition. The catalogue talked of, for instance, the Holbein-esque portrait of Mrs. Grant Murray, the Frans Hals-influenced Collier portraits, the Murillo-like boy playing with a feather, and so on and so forth. And it concluded in this way. Walters, it says, like many other Welsh artists, has been neglected by scholars and therefore has not been included in any serious debate connected with the development of modernism. And it's fascinating here because we have a conflicted rhetoric here of, on the one hand, national appeal and a simultaneous reliance on contributionism to justify the national case. What had happened, in fact, was that the work revealed by the application of a new methodology had been co-opted by an essentially unreconstructed conservative mainstream which retained its faith in self-referential art and in validation by artistic excellence. Now, English assumptions about British homogeneity and the right to appropriate what the metropolitan eye sees as the margins are also still prevalent. Again, I want to be practical and show you how this actually impacts on us. Last year, at a Tate Gallery seminar at Compton Verney, the curator explained plans to increase visitor numbers to that collection. She acknowledged that, notwithstanding the sumptuous high art shown at that house, what most people came to see was the folk art collection. And it was with that folk art collection that the potential lay for increasing the number of visitors still further. To this end, the curator proposed that the collection be renamed the British National Folk Art Collection. Now, I made 3 observations to the conference about that. First, I pointed out that with a tiny number of exceptions, I think 2 or 3 pieces, the collection was of English work. Secondly, that there were significant differences in the material itself between England and Wales, and absolutely crucial differences in the meaning of the material in terms of the wider cultures of Wales and England that would require completely different interpretive structures. And thirdly, I pointed out that in Wales we have had a national folk art collection since the 1930s, and since 1948 it has been located at the first and what is still the largest and most visited folk museum in Britain, St Fagans. However, as far as I know, nobody in Wales, and certainly not in England, has ever proposed that St Fagans be renamed the British National Folk Art Collection. That's a curious point, isn't it? I made clear to the curator that I was very supportive of the notion of an English national collection, but please, could she call it just that? Now, in the 1970s and 80s, the historical impetus of political evolution in Wales forced us to focus very much on the role of England. The most potent and immediate attacks on our identity at that time were perceived as those of industrial decline in the South Wales valleys and language decline in the north and west. English people and institutions were perceived as fundamentally implicated in both English governmental policy and the destruction of the coal industry, and English inward immigration driven by wealth imbalance in the erosion of the language. Alongside direct action, the burning of second homes, there were bombs. In addition to those direct actions, artists engaged in resistance, and the inability of the centre to comprehend the perceptions of the margins was made sometimes almost laughably manifest. And again, I'd like to give you a specific example. The two worlds of metropolitan art, fashion, and Welsh social crisis met at an exhibition staged by the Welsh Arts Council in 1977. It was organised on behalf of the Welsh Arts Council by a London art critic, Caroline Tisdale, as it happens, and involved importing to Wales a series of performance works which were shown at the National Eisteddfod, which is an annual cultural festival in Wales. In response, a young Welsh artist called Paul Davis created an independent piece outside the door of the official pavilion in which he carried above his head, Atlas fashion, a huge Welsh knot. Now, this was the board hung around the necks of children in Welsh schools as a punishment if caught speaking Welsh in the second half of the 19th century, when government persecution of the language was at its height. Now, Paul's protest served both to draw attention to the present plight of the language, of course, and the nation it signified, and the implication in their decline of the values of the metropolitan art establishment. During his performance, Davis was angrily confronted by the Italian artist Mario Merz, who, with no sense of irony at all, accused Davis of drawing public attention away from the official avant-garde. That was a term also used by Caroline Tisdale when interviewed by the BBC about her response to this. We are the official avant-garde. Now, although not apparent at the time, Davis's action against what was described then as the international circus signified a turning point in the evolution of art practice in Wales. The event has been rightly described as the most potent image of contemporary Welsh art. I quote, "It was an individual artist's public declaration of Welsh identity and content to the Welsh nation, a challenge of the dispossessed in their own land, the disempowered Welsh artist to the Welsh cultural establishment." Now, it's interesting to note that although the immediate agency here was the London art world, those involved truly represented what was, as I say, identified as the international art circus. And this brings me to the second area of change that I want to point out to you that has emerged in the last quarter century. In the 1970s and 80s, a direct action against the immediate sharp end of the attack, I think, distracted us somewhat from deeper forces at work. The intervening 25 years are those of the digital revolution, and with that revolution has come widespread awareness of issues and debate about globalization. In a recent essay that I published in Jonathan Harris's collection, Globalization and Contemporary Art, I no longer framed the problem of Wales and Welsh art in terms of English hegemony, but as that of all small or stateless nations against the wider hegemony of international capitalism. So today I want to question, as other speakers have done, whether we are discussing the underlying issue of identity and location of visual cultures in the most appropriate context if we do so in terms of Britishness alone. It may well be that we are asking yesterday's question. This is not to say that these two frameworks represent different issues. The issue is, in fact, exactly the same: power and periphery. As an example of how this concern is presently manifested internationally, I want to quote briefly from a 2006 collection of essays called Museum Philosophy for the 21st Century. The contribution of Donald Preciosi arose, I note, from his experience of a Tate Gallery conference on the future of art museums some years ago, so we have indeed been here before. Preciosi felt that the conference organisers had constrained the argument to managerial issues primarily related to budgets and to securing excellence in what the museum exhibited. This is what he said. The philosophy of the museum of the 21st century, articulated so poignantly at the Tate by the directors of the world's major museums, was being written quite literally in stone, a content-free and ethically vacuous philosophy of excellence. Yet at the end of the last century, this was not a new jargon, but a very old one, a politics of hyper-commodification and super-hyped consumption, written in an upgraded and globalized, that is, neo-feudalist, fantasy language of corporate accountancy. The language, at a cursory glance, seems new, but the underlying syntax replicates existing hegemonic relations of power. Now, that's a rather more wordy way of putting it than I would put, but the essence of it I agree with. And I want to point out that in Wales, notwithstanding our focus in the 1980s on England and the question of Britishness, this wider context was one of which we were well aware. And I want to draw your attention to a paper written by a colleague of mine, sadly dead now, and called Clifford McLucas, about Arts Council policy and filmmaking in Wales. It was written about the same time that I wrote my own cultural policy document. This is what he said. The cultures of Wales are changing. Some, generally those who are part of those cultures, would refer to that change as death. Like most cultures, they appear to be being dissolved and replaced by a pervasive and powerful Anglo-American model. Like instant food, it is more or less at home anywhere, goes equally well or badly with any other dish, and it fills your belly. It might be difficult to determine where or how it originated, but we might be able to agree that it was not in Wales. It might not, in fact, be a real or rooted culture in the sense that we would normally use the term at all. McLuhan spoke of the global village, but 20 years on, we might prefer the term the global housing estate. Now, the phrase not a rooted culture is, of course, the signifier of the evolution of ideas that I'm suggesting here. What we're dealing with is death by assimilation, precisely the same end that the English state has pursued in Wales for nearly 500 years. However, the initiating force in the present is not a state. Writing from a nationalist position of commitment to both cultural individuation as a principle and Welsh individuation in particular, McLucas understood globalization as a new name for an old phenomenon. Contrary to prevailing attitudes in the avant-garde art worlds of the metropolitan centres in Europe and the United States, he perceived globalization as simply the latest name for the imperialism which threatened to eradicate the vestiges of independent ways of being and thinking that small and stateless nations had struggled to maintain throughout the modern period. The latest agent of cultural imperialism, identified by McLucas, was a combination of the then new digital media and commerce, which presented an insidious and structurally different challenge from the agents of the past. Small and stateless nations had developed strategies of resistance to conventional imperialisms, and indeed, the fact that past threats had emanated from clearly discerned state-based cultures had often facilitated the construction of strong oppositional identities in nations such as Wales. However, threats emanating from an invisible or fluid place, rather than from a real or rooted culture, might prove more difficult to resist. The new threat of death by homogenization, the source of which was so elusive, required a different kind of resistance. Now today, we might be tempted to project even further and see that context as too narrow. My belief is that the affirmation of cultural particularity remains a central concern, but it might seem that the issue is now no longer how to affirm particularity in the face of the immediate political hegemony of Britishness or of economic globalization, but of how to proceed in a period when the survival of all human cultures is under threat on a comprehensible timescale, perhaps in the time of our children's children. It is tempting to consider that the environmental threat faced by all of us supersedes the capitalist threat to individual cultures and to the affirmation of cultural difference as an essential expression of our humanity. However, it seems to me that the two problems are closely related, and that not only is there no contradiction between the continued affirmation of cultural particularity and dealing with global environmental degradation, but that the pursuit of the one offers the best hope of reversing the other. It is plainly the case that massive cultural conglomerate states and imperialist states, both present and emergent, we've heard a lot about China this morning, are the least able or willing to adapt, since expansionism in all its aspects drives them. Political influence and economic power abroad and the increase of internal consumption are essential to their stability. Small nations are able both to adapt faster in terms of their governmental policies and are psychologically more ready to do so since they tend to have greater levels of internal coherence, not internal homogeneity, which in truth was never a reality, but a scale which enables individuals to comprehend and accommodate diversity within civic identity. In a sense, I'm hinting to you in England, join us. It's now in England's interest also to abandon Britishness and facilitate difference and reduced scale. Finally, from Wales itself, reinventing ourselves, a process crystallised in a famous dictum of Gwynalf Williams's, that Wales is an artefact which the Welsh produce, does not mean rejecting our past, as faux progressives sometimes seek to suggest. It does not require us to abandon and to forget the cultural markers that defined us at earlier points in our evolution. On the contrary, reinvention requires that we take all of them with us, but that we understand that in their continued utilisation, we must also revise our understandings of them as the situations in which we find ourselves necessitate. It means that we pursue social evolution informed by our particular cultural experience, including both the experience of our internal circumstances and observation of the circumstances of other communities. Our experience in Wales teaches us to be internationalist, but not to be seduced by facile internationalism. If survival comes to require homogeneity, then the change in the nature of human culture will have been so great as to leave me, for one, standing outside with nothing to say, for I will not recognise it as fully human. Thank you.